He had the warrant in his left hand, and her photograph in his right. He'd been staring at both for 20 minutes. The lantern on his desk was burning low. Outside, the wind was moving through Caldwell Creek the way it always did after midnight, slow and deliberate, like it was checking on things. The warrant was signed by a federal judge. The photograph was creased down the middle from where he'd folded it and unfolded it too many times. In it, she was looking slightly away from the camera, the way people do when they don't entirely trust the person holding it. Her name was written on the back in someone else's handwriting. Elena Vasquez, wanted. $500. He set both down on the desk. He pressed his hands flat on the wood. He looked at the star pinned to his chest, the one he'd worn for 11 years without once questioning what it asked of him. Tonight was the first time he questioned it, and before this night was over, everything he had built his life on would be tested in a way he hadn't seen coming. Before we go any further, if stories like this move something in you, if you believe that the most important choices a person makes are the ones nobody else sees, hit that subscribe button right now. This is Desert Heart Cinema, and we tell the stories the history books were too careful to write down. His name was Marshal James Calloway, and in Caldwell Creek, New Mexico territory, that name meant something specific. It meant the man who had brought in the Decker brothers without firing a single shot. It meant the lawman who had ridden 4 days to a February blizzard to return a stolen payroll to a mining company whose workers hadn't eaten in a week. It meant the person you called when the situation was beyond what ordinary men could handle. Not because Calloway was harder than other men, but because he was more honest. About everything, including himself. He was 41 years old, tall, with the kind of lean build that comes not from youth, but from a life that didn't allow for softness. His hair had gone gray at the temples sometime in his mid-30s, and he hadn't thought much about it. He had a scar along his left jaw from a knife fight in El Paso in 1871 that he never talked about. His eyes were the dark amber of creek water in October, the color of something that has moved a long way and seen a lot along the route. He had never been married, not because he hadn't wanted to be, but because the work had a way of making that particular want feel like something from another man's life. He had a small house at the edge of Caldwell Creek, with 3 rooms and a porch he sat on in the evenings. He had a horse named General, who was 15 years old and still the most reliable living thing in his life. He had a code, a real one, not the kind men talked about in saloons, the kind that lived in the bones and showed up in small decisions nobody was watching. That code had never once failed him, until the night Elena Vasquez rode into Caldwell Creek on a horse that was almost dead and collapsed on the steps of the church. He hadn't been the first one to find her. That was Father Mendoza, who heard the horse and came out with a lantern and found a young woman lying unconscious on the church steps with a bullet wound in her right shoulder and a child's small hand gripping her left. A boy, maybe 6 years old, dark-eyed and completely silent, sitting beside her in the cold and not making a single sound. The boy had looked up at Father Mendoza and said, in very careful English, "She said God lives here. She said he would help." Father Mendoza had sent for the doctor. The doctor had sent for the marshal. And Marshal James Calloway had arrived at the church at 2 a.m. to find Elena Vasquez unconscious on a cot in the vestry, a 6-year-old boy asleep sitting upright in a wooden chair beside her, with his small hand still holding hers even in sleep, and a federal warrant in his own coat pocket that he had been carrying for 3 weeks without finding its subject. He had found her now. He stood in the doorway of that vestry for a long time. Father Mendoza watched him from across the room. The doctor watched him from beside the cot. Neither of them spoke. Calloway looked at the woman. He looked at the boy. He looked at the warrant in his hand. Then he folded it, put it back in his pocket, and said, "Nobody came here tonight." That was the first crack. Now, here is what the warrant didn't say. What warrants never say, because warrants deal in facts, and facts are the smallest part of most stories. Elena Vasquez was 29 years old. She had been born in Santa Fe to a Mexican father and an Irish mother, which in 1883, New Mexico territory meant she belonged fully to neither world and had learned early to navigate the space between. Her father had been a silversmith, a good one, known as far as Albuquerque for the quality of his work. He had died when Elena was 17, of a fever that a doctor with more resources might have treated. Her mother had followed 2 years later of grief, which is a real thing regardless of what doctors write on certificates. Elena had raised her younger sister Maria on what work she could find: laundry, cooking, seamstress work, translation, anything. She was smart and she was fast, and she had a quality that people in difficult circumstances develop or don't. She could read a room. She could tell in the first 10 seconds of an interaction what the person across from her needed and whether it was something she could provide safely. She had married at 23, a man named Thomas Reed. Anglo, ambitious, charming in the specific way that men who need something from you are always charming. He worked for a land company. He had ideas about acquiring property in the territory at prices the current owners didn't understand they were accepting. She had understood what he was within the first year. She had left him within the second. He had not taken that quietly. The warrant for Elena Vasquez had been filed by Thomas Reed's lawyer, citing theft of property. Specifically, documents. Documents that Elena had taken when she left. Documents that, if presented to the right federal authority, would demonstrate that Thomas Reed's land company had been defrauding Mexican and indigenous landowners across 3 counties for 6 years. She hadn't stolen those documents to protect herself. She had stolen them to use them. And Thomas Reed had enough money and enough connections to make sure the law came for her before she could use them against him. The boy was her nephew, Maria's son. Maria had died in childbirth 8 months ago. Elena had taken the boy and run. That was the story the warrant didn't tell. Calloway didn't know any of this yet, but something in the way that child held his aunt's hand, even in sleep, told him that the story he was holding in his pocket was not the whole one. She woke on the second day. The bullet had been removed. The fever had broken sometime before dawn. She opened her eyes in the vestry of a church she didn't recognize and found a tall, gray-templed Marshal sitting in the wooden chair beside her cot, reading a book, entirely at ease, as if sitting beside the bed of a wanted woman were a perfectly ordinary way to spend a Tuesday morning. She went very still, the way prey animals go still, every muscle remembering the threat before the mind is fully caught up. He looked up from the book. Those October amber eyes, steady and without urgency. He said, "The boy is fine. He's in the kitchen with Father Mendoza. He ate 4 biscuits this morning, which I'm told is some kind of record." She said nothing. He said, "The doctor says another day before you should try to sit up. The shoulder was clean. You were lucky with the angle." She said very carefully, "You have a warrant." He said, "I have a lot of things." She watched him. He watched her. The morning light came through the single small vestry window and lay across the floor between them like something neutral. She said, "Then why am I still here instead of in your jail?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because your nephew needed breakfast, and because I had some reading to catch up on." She stared at him. He returned to his book. This was not the answer she had prepared for. "Stay right here, because I need you to understand what is about to happen and why it will cost both of them more than either is ready for. If this story already has its hands around your heart, you know what to do. Subscribe to *Desert Heart Cinema, *. Turn on that notification bell, because we don't let these stories go unfinished. The next 3 days were the strangest of James Calloway's 11-year career as a marshal. He brought her food in the mornings. He sat with the boy, whose name was Miguel, in the afternoons, teaching him to play cards with a patience that surprised even Father Mendoza, who had known Calloway for 9 years. He did not send the telegram that would have brought federal deputies to Caldwell Creek within 48 hours. He told himself he was waiting for her to be well enough to travel. He told himself this was professional consideration, nothing more. He was lying to himself. He knew it. He kept doing it anyway. On the 3rd evening, she was sitting up. Miguel was asleep on a cot in the corner. The church was quiet. Calloway brought 2 cups of coffee, real coffee, not the burnt approximation the jail usually offered, and set one on the small table beside her without being asked. She looked at the coffee for a moment. Then, She looked at him. She said, "You should have sent that telegram 3 days ago." He sat down. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. He said, "Probably." She heard the echo of something in that word, something familiar in the way he used it, not as dismissal but as admission. She filed it away. She said, "I have documents in the saddlebag that came in with my horse. I need you to look at them." He said, "That's not how this works." She said, "Marshal, a man named Thomas Reed has been stealing land from families who didn't understand what they were signing for 6 years. I have the proof. I am the only person who has the proof. And he has enough money to make sure I disappear before I can use it." She paused. "That's how this works." He looked at her for a long time. That steady amber gaze that she was beginning to understand did not mean he was slow. It meant he was thorough. He said, "Where did the bullet come from?" She said, "Reed's man. 3 days east of here. He's been following me for 2 weeks." Calloway set down his coffee. He stood up. He walked to the small vestry window and looked out at Caldwell Creek's dark Main Street for a long moment. He said, without turning around, "How many documents?" she said. "Enough." He read them that night. All of them. Alone at his desk with the lantern burning and General shifting in the stable outside and the town asleep around him, it took him 4 hours. He was a careful reader. He read the way he did everything, thoroughly, without rushing, turning each page with the understanding that what was written there deserved his full attention. When he finished, he sat for a long time without moving. The documents were not just enough. They were devastating. Names, dates, amounts, forged signatures, payments to local officials, records of intimidation, 6 years of systematic theft, meticulously documented by a man who had been arrogant enough to keep records because he believed he would never be caught. Thomas Reed had stolen land from 43 families. He had used the law, the actual machinery of courts and warrants and territorial authority, to do it. And now, he was using that same machinery to silence the one person who could prove it. The warrant for Elena Vasquez was not justice. It was the opposite of justice, wearing justice's clothes. Calloway looked at his badge. He had worn it for 11 years on the understanding that it represented something real, that the law, imperfect as it was, bent toward right more often than wrong if the people enforcing it were honest. He had just spent 4 hours reading proof that someone had turned that understanding inside out and used it as a weapon against the people it was meant to protect. He picked up the warrant. He held it for a long moment. Then he picked up a pen, and he began to write a very different kind of letter, not to the federal office that had issued the warrant, but to a territorial judge in Santa Fe named Aldrich, who Calloway had known for 20 years and who he trusted with a specific and rare completeness. He wrote for 2 hours. He enclosed copies of the most critical documents. He sealed the envelope himself. He sat back and understood with complete clarity what he had just done. He had not destroyed the warrant. He had not broken the law, but he had stepped onto a line that a marshal was not supposed to stand on. The line between enforcing the law and deciding which laws deserved enforcing. He had been certain about every decision he'd made in 11 years. He was not certain about this one. And that uncertainty felt, terrifyingly, like the most honest thing he'd felt in years. She knew something had shifted when he came back the next morning. It wasn't anything he said. It was the way he moved, with the particular deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that cost him something and is not going to unmake it. She recognized it because she moved the same way. It was the walk of people who lead with what is right, even when right is expensive. He sat down. He placed the saddlebag on the table between them. He said, "I sent a letter to Judge Aldrich in Santa Fe, with copies of enough documents to open a formal investigation into Thomas Reed." She stared at him. He said, "It will take time. Aldrich is careful, but he's honest. If anyone can move this through the right channels, it's him." She said, "And the warrant?" He looked at her directly. "Still exists. I can't make it not exist." She said, "Then I'm still a fugitive." He said, "For now." A pause. Reed's man who shot you. Does he know you came to Caldwell Creek? She said. He tracked me for 2 weeks. He'll figure it out. Calloway nodded slowly. He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. He said, without turning, "Can you ride?" She said, "Not yet, 2 more days." He said, "Then we have 2 days." He walked out. She sat in the morning light of the vestry and understood that a marshal in Caldwell Creek, New Mexico territory had just quietly decided to stand between her and the law he represented. She didn't know what to do with that. She had stopped trusting men with authority so long ago that the mechanism for it had gone quiet in her. But something about James Calloway, his amber eyes, his careful reading, his coffee without being asked, the way he'd taught Miguel to play cards for 3 afternoons without once making it feel like charity, was waking something up. She pressed her hand over her bandaged shoulder. She looked at Miguel sleeping in the corner. She thought, 2 days. Reed's man arrived on the morning of the 2nd day. His name was Briggs. He was not a subtle man. He rode in on a gray horse at 9 in the morning and went directly to the saloon and asked questions in the specific way that men who are paid to find people ask questions. Openly, without pretense, because the threat in the openness is the point. By 9:30, Calloway knew he was there. By 10, he knew why. By 10:15, he was standing in the saloon doorway, looking at Briggs with the particular stillness that people in Caldwell Creek recognized as the marshal deciding something. Briggs was a big man, hired muscle, with a legal veneer. He carried papers identifying him as an agent of Reed's Land Company, with authority to assist in the apprehension of wanted persons. The papers were real. The authority was real. Technically, legally, Briggs had every right to be in Caldwell Creek asking about Elena Vasquez. Calloway said, "I know who you're looking for." Briggs smiled. "Then we can make this simple." Calloway said, "She's in my custody, under my jurisdiction. You want access to a prisoner in my custody. You get a territorial court order. Not a company paper. A court order." He paused. "Caldwell Creek is my town. The law here moves at my pace." Briggs's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. He said, "I can have a court order in 4 days." Calloway said, "Then I'll see you in 4 days." He walked out. He had bought 4 days. Maybe. He had also just told a man working for Thomas Reed exactly where Elena Vasquez was, which meant Reed would know within 24 hours, which meant whatever pressure Reed could bring to bear on the territorial court would be applied immediately. 4 days, possibly less. He went directly to the church. Here is what happened in those 4 days. And here is the part of this story that Caldwell Creek talked about for 30 years afterward. Calloway moved the documents, the originals, to 3 separate locations, with witnesses he trusted, each holding a portion and each knowing that the others held portions. He wrote 2 more letters, one to a newspaper editor in Albuquerque he had done a favor for in 1879, one to a lawyer in Santa Fe who had been trying to build a case against Reed's Land Company for 2 years without enough evidence. He did all of this openly, during the day, in his capacity as a marshal, using every legal tool he had access to, because the law, he had decided, was not the same thing as the men who are currently wielding it, and the law belonged to the people it was supposed to protect. On the evening of the 3rd day, he went to the church. Elena was on her feet, moving carefully, favoring her right side, but moving. Miguel was beside her, holding her left hand the way he always did. She had washed her hair and it was down, and she looked, in the vestry candlelight, like someone who had been through the worst of something and had decided to keep going anyway. Calloway stood in the doorway. He said, "Judge Aldrich replied, he's opening an investigation. It'll take months, but it's started." She said, "Briggs?" He said, "Still here. Court order coming, maybe tomorrow." She nodded. She had known this was the shape of it. She said, "Then I need to leave tonight." He said, "I know." She looked at him carefully. She said, "You could have turned me in 4 days ago. You could have let Briggs take me this morning. You could have let—" She stopped. Started again. Why? He was quiet for a long moment. The candle between them was very still. He said, "Because the law is supposed to mean something, and somebody had to make sure it still did." She held his gaze. She said, "That's not the whole answer." He looked at her. Those amber eyes with 30 years of careful living in them. He said very quietly, "No, it isn't." The room was completely still. Miguel looked up at his aunt, then at the Marshal, then back at his aunt with the specific understanding of children who see everything adults think they're hiding. She rode out before dawn. Calloway saddled the horse himself, a better horse than the one she'd arrived on, a steady roan mare from his own stable. He packed enough supplies for 10 days. He gave her a written letter, signed, sealed with his official seal, stating that she was traveling under Marshal's protection in connection with an ongoing federal investigation. It wasn't exactly true yet. It would be, once Aldrich's investigation was formally opened. He was operating in the space between what was true and what was about to become true, which was the most dangerous legal ground a Marshal could stand on. He held the horse while she mounted, carefully because of the shoulder. Miguel was already up, sitting in front of the saddle with the solemn self-possession of a child who has learned not to ask for what he can't have. She gathered the reins. She looked down at Calloway in the gray, pre-dawn light. She said, "The investigation, if it goes the right way, if Reed is charged, the warrant goes away." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" He said, "Aldrich moves carefully. 6 months, maybe 8. She looked at him for a long moment. The sky behind him was beginning to go from black to the deep blue that comes just before color returns to the world. She said, "James." It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed. She said, "What you did here, what you risked. I need you to know that I—" She stopped. She was not, it turned out, a woman who finished sentences like that easily. She had spent too many years in the space between worlds where you learn not to say things that could be used against you. He said, "I know." 2 words. The way certain things get said between certain people, completely, without needing more. She nodded. She touched her heels to the horse. She rode out into the pre-dawn dark of the New Mexico territory with her nephew in front of her, and his small hands on the saddle horn and the whole uncertain west ahead. Calloway stood in the street and watched until she was gone, until the sound of hooves became silence, and the silence became the ordinary sounds of a town beginning to wake up. Then he turned around, walked back to his office, sat down at his desk. The warrant was still there. He picked it up. He held it. He thought about 11 years, about the code that lived in the bones, about the difference between the law and justice and how sometimes, not often, but sometimes, a person had to choose which one they were actually serving. He set the warrant down. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at Caldwell Creek, waking up in the early light. Briggs arrived with the court order at 8 that morning. Calloway read it carefully. He said, "The prisoner is no longer in my custody. She was released pursuant to an ongoing federal investigation under Judge Aldrich's authority." He handed Briggs a copy of Aldrich's letter. "You want to argue with a federal judge? His address is in Santa Fe." Briggs stared at him for a long time. Then he left. 6 months and 12 days later, Thomas Reed was indicted on 43 counts of land fraud, forgery, and corruption of public officials. The evidence came from 3 sources simultaneously: a Santa Fe lawyer, an Albuquerque newspaper, and a federal investigation opened by Judge Aldrich on the basis of documents provided by an unnamed source. The warrant for Elena Vasquez was formally withdrawn on a Thursday in October. Calloway received notice of it by telegraph. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He sat on his porch that evening as the sun went down over the New Mexico desert and turned everything the color of the desert wildflowers that came up every September, whether anyone planted them or not. He did not know where she was. He had not tried to find out. That had been deliberate. A person who had spent years running needed first to stop, to find solid ground, to remember what ordinary felt like before they could trust anything new. He understood this because he was a careful man, and careful men understand that timing is not impatience in disguise, it is respect. 3 weeks after the warrant was withdrawn, on a Tuesday morning in November, a woman rode into Caldwell Creek on a steady roan mare. A boy of nearly 7 sat in front of her in the saddle with his hands on the horn and his dark eyes taking in everything. She tied the horse outside the marshal's office. She lifted Miguel down. She straightened her coat. She walked up the 2 steps to the door and knocked. He opened it. They looked at each other in the November morning light. The roan mare shifted behind her. Miguel looked up at the marshal with complete seriousness and said, "She said you would want to know the warrant was gone." Calloway looked at the boy, then at the woman. He said, "She was right." Elena Vasquez looked at him, at the gray temples and the amber eyes and the scar along his jaw, and the star on his chest that he had worn for 11 years and never once questioned, until the night he questioned everything. She said, "I brought the horse back." He said, "Keep it." She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he had ever seen on her face, and it was, he thought, the most valuable thing he had seen in 11 years of collecting valuable things in a difficult territory. He stepped back from the door. He said, "There's coffee, real coffee." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she looked at Miguel. Miguel was already walking through the door like he had been expected. She followed. Some men spend their whole lives serving the law and never once have to decide what it actually means. James Calloway was not one of those men. He had one night, one warrant, one woman on a church step, and one child holding her hand in the dark. And in that moment, with the lantern burning low and the star in his chest, and everything he'd built his life on sitting in the balance, he chose the thing that the law was supposed to be about in the first place. Not the paper, not the warrant, not the machinery, the people. If this story moves something in you, if you believe that the most important choices are the ones nobody sees you make, then you are exactly where you belong. This is Desert Heart Cinema *. Subscribe. Share this with someone who still believes that justice and mercy can live in the same heart. We will see you in the next story. The West has many more secrets, and we are not finished telling them. Oh.